Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
Thank you very much, and I just want to say how honoured I am to be here today. I just want to check the microphone is working. Can you hear me at the back? Yes? Excellent. If at any point you can't, just wave your hand and I will do my best to adjust. I would like to thank the International School and the South Asia Research Institute for organising this event, which gives me a chance to share some of my most recent research. And the paper I'm giving to you today is actually still much a work in progress, and I'm really looking forward to the question and answer session where to be challenged on it to make it hopefully even better. Before I give my talk, though, I just want to say a very, very big thank you to Professor Lorraine Elliott, who, as said, we've known each other since her time as a visiting professor at Balliol College at the University of Oxford. Far too many moons ago now, but I've also had the pleasure of working with her on projects on human security in particular at the University of Nottingham, and look forward to working with you at many points in the future as well. So what I'm going to talk about today is the question of dangers of democracy, or to democracy rather, in India. And I've deliberately put a question mark after this title because one of the things I want to problematise is to what extent is much of the rhetoric that we hear about the Modi government in particular accurate. How do we assess this rhetoric? How do we assess the claims of people who say that India's democracy is under threat? So, to start off, I mean, for those of you who are not as aware of the Indian experience, India holds, kind of the record of being the world's largest democracy. This picture before you is one of India's 1 million electronic voting machines. I haven't got that wrong. 1 million electronic voting machines. You can just about see on this slide, you have not only the names of the candidate, but you also have the symbol of the political party. And these are really important where a large percentage of the population is still illiterate, much less than at independence, but this is still a challenge for India. So symbols are very, very important and are hotly contested, as we saw recently in the Uttar Pradesh state elections. India does very well in terms of its democratic status in South Asia as a whole. So although I accept that there are problems with Freedom House scores, a lot of stuff gets bundled in that maybe we would not want to consider as part of assessing whether a country is a democracy or not. What I think Freedom House has over other measures such as Polity IV is that it does also concentrate on civil liberties. And one of the things I'm going to talk about today is the importance of civil liberties for a working, effective democratic regime. And so in this measure, lower is better, for those of you who aren't aware of Freedom House. So anything under this line is seen to be free. Anything above this line is seen to be, in between this line is seen to be partly free. So you can see this seems to have slipped down slightly in terms of the transition from the PowerPoint to my laptop to the computer. But India is the only one that is measured as being free within South Asia. All the other ones are measured as being partly free. Okay? And a lot of that is to do with not just elections, but things like civil liberties. So democracy in India, again, a very brief recap for those of you who aren't as aware of the democratic history of the country. It's had a nearly unbroken democratic record since 1947. The emergency between 1975 and 77 was constitutionally called, but we must question whether many of the activities, such as the arrests of the opposition, putting people in jail, compulsory sterilisations, were compatible with the democratic status of India at that time. So that's why I say that that's nearly unbroken democratic record. We also know that there are places within India, such as the northeast of India, Kashmir, and other times of emergency in the states of Punjab, where the Indian state has not behaved particularly democratically. And Freedom House, interestingly, actually looks at Jammu and Kashmir and gives it a separate score when assessing the democratic status of that area, as it does, incidentally, with the Pakistani side of Kashmir as well. 1951, the electorate was 173 million people. Huge, absolutely enormous. India's achievement at granting universal suffrage to everybody in 1951 is a huge achievement and one that deserves a lot of recognition. 2014, that had increased somewhat, so you now have a situation where the electorate is 814 million people. 100 million of those who had come, to kind of voting age very, very recently, many of whom are under the age of 26 years old. There's a huge youth bulge in South Asia, not just in India, but also in countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh as well. The 2014 elections were held over 36 days, which caused enormous problems for me because I came up with this great idea of running a blog series, India Votes. And so I came up with this idea, thought, yeah, I've got enough people I can get to write stuff on this. So you've got to allow for the month before the elections to get these blogs running. And then the schedule came out. Now, this is being recorded, so I'm not going to tell you the word I used when I saw the schedule, but it wasn't very polite. So we effectively had a blog series that ran over 2.5 months, assessing the Indian elections and their aftermath, which was very successful, but quite a long period to be doing this over. It's not, however, an entirely rosy picture, and I'm going to give you some examples of why this is. So I was in Hyderabad in 2015, and I was hoping this would be a little bit bigger on the screen. But essentially, this slide here is a picture I took of a poster on the wall of the Hyderabad Students' Union at the University of Hyderabad, 50 Shades of Modi. And despite the joke, the actual kind of things that they cut and pasted as elements that they were worried about within the Indian polity make very, very sobering reading. In June last year, you have the incident of a Muslim boy being stabbed to death after an argument about, kind of eating beef turned into a religious attack. I put this up, a horrific case, but sadly it's not the only one. It's one of many, it's part of a bigger picture. And it's not just been about kind of Hindu-Muslim relations that India's made the news for. So in September last year, a very prominent author, Gauri Lankesh, who criticised Modi and the Hindutva project of kind of making India more Hindu, was actually shot dead outside her home. And again, the actual killing of a journalist is quite rare, certainly within the heartlands of India. It's more common in places like the northeast of India. But it follows, again, a well-established campaign of intimidation on places like Twitter in particular, which I've experienced, but a small proportion of what some Indian academics have experienced, but I get attacked too. And the material that was coming out after her death on Twitter was really celebrating her death. And it was a very, very nasty period. And many of my friends in India are, rightly worried about the tone of the debate and what is classified as being anti-national, what you're allowed to say, what you're not allowed to say. And the discourse does seem to be changing. So the question is, does this pose a danger to democracy? And to answer this, we really need to go back to Political Science 101. And I'm not going to spend too long on this, especially for those of you who aren't political scientists. But essentially, democracy, is it, the best way of thinking about it really is it a dichotomy? So it either is a democracy, it's not. You see it, you know it when you see it, when it's not. But you know, what is it when it is? So something like, you know, Pervez Musharraf taking control in Pakistan, we obviously know is not democratic. But there are many, many more cases where it's a lot shadier, where, well, they have elections, but is it, you know, is that enough? So if we look at Sri Lanka, for example, is having elections sufficient, or do you need inclusion of minorities, for example, as well, for it to be an effective democracy? I would favour always looking at democracy, and I've written on this in relation to Pakistan, as a continuum. So a country can be more or less democratic, but it's important we don't just look at this on one criteria, free and fair elections. Because what we see in the world today is you have many countries which do have relatively free and fair elections, but may have a lot of constraints on freedom of the press, civic associations, freedom of associations, the right to campaign without violence or intimidation. So I see it very much as the need to have a continuum, but a multi-dimensional continuum, which makes it messy, but I think it's important to do that. The other thing to think about is, of course, democracy is about the rule of the majority. But what does that then say about minority rights? And a lot of people have questioned, well, is it just about, you know, if a minority is a perpetual minority, does that violate the assumption of equality? Because the idea also behind democracy, it's not just about numbers, it's about every vote is equal. Now, if a group, whether that be Tamils in Sri Lanka or, as some would say, Muslims in India, are consigned to be a perpetual minority, is that democratic if their interests are ignored and they are kind of frozen out of political debate? And so one of the things I seek to do is to try to understand whether India, and you know, when I started off, I should stress I'm very open-minded about this, whether India can be understood as being an ethnic democracy, given many of the debates that we've seen and much of the charges that have been made against Modi and the BJP government. And Sami Smuhar, who is an Israeli political scientist, came up with this concept. And he talks about it as applying to democracies. It's important this describes democracies that give civil and political rights to individuals, but combine it with institutionalised dominance over the state by one particular ethnic group. Importantly, his concept doesn't preclude the idea that minorities can have certain collective rights. So he's not saying that minorities may be completely ignored, that they don't have any control over their cultural communities should they want to. But he's saying even if you have that, it's still possible to then have institutionalised dominance by a particular ethnic group. And I seek to apply this to India while noting that the idea of Hindus as being an ethnic group is incredibly problematic, given the idea, you know, given the divisions within the Hindu community, and given the fact that there are far more Hindus who are opponents of Narendra Modi than there are who are supporters of Narendra Modi. Only 31% of the Indian population voted for Narendra Modi's BJP in the 2014 election. It's a legacy of the British simple plurality electoral system that allowed him to convert that into an absolute majority of seats in the Lok Sabina, much to the surprise of, well, just about everybody, including myself, who works on Indian politics. So if we're going to apply this to India, does this work, essentially? It's been applied to many, many divergent regimes, and you know we can talk about the many of the post-Soviet republics, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, many of whom who then came up with restrictions, for example, on their Russian-speaking population. But how do we analyse it? How can we measure whether India is this ethnic democracy, and why should we do so? As should be clear, if I say democracy should be analysed according to multiple criteria, I think that ethnic democracy also needs to be analysed according to multiple criteria. And we also need to put it on a continuum. It's not enough to say, well, is India an ethnic democracy or it's not? What I think is important for India, but other countries as well, and I include the UK in this analysis, in this assessment, to what extent is countries or are countries moving either towards a more ethnically democratic state or democratically ethnic state, whichever you want to put it, or maybe moving away from that. And what I have done in this paper is I look at formal and informal measures. I don't think it's enough to just look at the Constitution. I think we have to look at effective citizenship, effective governance. And as importantly, we need to do this over time. So one of the things Modi's been criticised for was, for example, the low proportion of Muslims in his cabinet after 2014. When I was writing an article for representation and I got this statistic and I thought, well, that sounds really low. But how do you know if it's low if we don't have the data going back to look at previous cabinets? How do we know whether everyone talks about this heyday of Congress secularism, compares it to the BJP under Modi, but how do we know if this is true or not unless we get comparative data over time? And that's one of the things I'm doing and I will be able to show you in this paper. So if we look at India, I'm going to talk primarily about the Hindu and Muslim divisions in this lecture, partly because this is the way in which a lot of the debate has been framed, partly because of reasons of time. I'm not denying that there's a real crisis in India at the moment with, for example, anti-Dalit violence, anti-scheduled caste violence, or against other kind of attacks on other religious minorities, in particular Christians. And the measures I've applied and I've kind of gone and I've analysed over time are the following. In terms of formal provisions, I look at the Constitution and challenges and changes to that over time. I look at citizenship, how citizenship rights are articulated within India, and again, the debates over changing them that we're seeing at the moment. Policy decisions, things that vary according to different governments. But then we need to look at much more informal measures as well. Things such as the levels of representation of different groups in different institutions of state. Looking at the way that discourse has changed. You know, what passes for a polite dinner party conversation? What's acceptable to say or not to say? And how do politicians talk? You know, what do they think they can get away with saying? And then finally, looking at the concept of horizontal inequalities. So not just picking up one particular, say, statistic on literacy rates, but maybe also then moving it around to look at, well, let's look at the Muslim community's position overall with regards to, you know, representation, literacy rates, socioeconomically. And as Francis Stewart and Graham Brown have talked about, if there's a correspondence across several different criteria, then that's a problem for a democracy. So I'm going to take you through, in the last kind of 25 minutes, talking through those six criteria and assess how India has performed, importantly, over time, not just looking at the current Modi government. So constitutions are really important. If you come from a country like I do, like the United Kingdom, we don't have a codified constitution. But the vast majority of other states do. And how they write about the Constitution, how they write about the people who are within it, who has rights, what kind of rights they have, are very important for political scientists in kind of assessing the identity of the state in particular. So in India, it's very, very important in the Indian Constitution, even though they didn't add it in until 1976, that India is secular. And that's a really, really important thing that was introduced into the Indian constitution, as opposed to in a comparison by, for example, Pakistan next door, or Ceylon, or Sri Lanka as it became. That secularism isn't the French form of secularism, the idea that, you know, there's a separation between religion and the state, but it means neutrality between religious groups. It was a rejection of the idea that India should be a Hindustan, land for the Hindus. Nehru and many of the congressmen were emphatic that this meant India should be their home. Didn't matter what religious group you came from. Didn't matter what linguistic group you came from. And that's important because 15% of the population of India after independence were non-Hindu. Even despite partition into Pakistan and India, even with that, and lots of Muslims moving over into Pakistan and lots of Hindus coming over into India, 15% of the population was still a member of a religious minority. And Articles 25 and 26 of the Constitution protect these religious minorities. They talk explicitly that these minorities have the right to profess and practice and propagate their religion. Okay, really, really inclusive provisions for these religious minorities. Some religious minorities, Muslims and Christians, had their personal laws protected as well. Something that was, again, very, very important for these communities, especially at the time of independence, when they were very, very worried about Hindu domination after the British had left the country. Interestingly, Sikhs, Buddhists and Jains did not have their personal laws protected. They were seen to be part of the Hindu fold, and the Constitution says that explicitly. Also importantly, minorities were not banned from office. So this is one of India's Muslim presidents, the father of the Indian bomb, Kalam. And again, this compares very favourably to a country like Pakistan, where you have to be a Muslim to be a prime minister or a president, and in fact you have to be a certain type of Muslim to take on those positions. However, there are elements where you can see this being not quite as inclusive, and the big debate was that over the choice of script. So there was a big debate in India over whether you should have Hindi being the national language, or Hindustani, which is much more an amalgamation of Urdu and Hindi, and generally tends to be written much more in the Roman script. And there was a huge debate over this, and eventually the proponents of Devanagari won out. And this is really important because this affected lots of Muslim communities who did not operate with that script. It affected their schooling, and it also affected the identification with the state. The other thing that you see constitutionally was the Uniform Civil Code. The idea that India should move towards a uniform civil code was still there in the Constitution, even though it was in part of the Constitution that was not allowed to be legislated on. What we have seen over the course of the last 30 years in particular has been the BJP has been challenging this. It's appeared in every single manifesto other than their 1999 one. I had the pleasure of reading all these manifestos. And although they frame it in terms of gender equality, they don't want Muslim personal law because this affects the rights of women in particular, this is something that is being challenged. And we see this in 2016. A law is or a case is brought to the Supreme Court challenging the practice of triple talaq, by which a man can divorce his wife in Islam by saying talaq, talaq, talaq 3 times. It's really important to say that this was not just the Hindu right bringing this case. This was supported by many, many gender groups. Many Muslims, women's groups as well, supported this. But the BJP also supported this. And eventually, the Supreme Court legislated that, yes, triple talaq was not something, this was illegal, and instructed the centre to the union government to bring in legislation to make this illegal. This, again, whether this challenges or leads towards more India being an ethnic democracy, on the face of it doesn't. As said, this was supported by a lot of Muslim groups, as well as the BJP, and a lot of women's groups as well. What people are worried about within India, certainly the people I kind of talked to and interview, is that this is really the thin end of the wedge, and this is something that's going to be used to chip away at Muslim personal law and to move towards more of a uniform civil code in the coming decades. So I don't think this is going to happen overnight. Whether this will even go through the Rajya Sabha, the upper house of the Parliament, before the time of the next elections is even questionable. But it's something I think that we need to watch, having seen the debate in the Indian newspapers about this issue. Secondly, let's look at citizenship rights. So, a territorial conception of citizenship was adopted by India after independence. They didn't base it on religion, didn't base it on language. It was essentially, if you were born or your parents were born in the territory of India, you had the right to get Indian citizenship. Those people who lived overseas had to choose. Would you retain Indian citizenship, or would you take on the citizenship of the country you lived in? Even those people who lived overseas did not have and who retained their Indian citizenship did not have the rights, the same rights as Indians living within India. So a really territorial notion of citizenship. And there's been moves away from this in recent decades, partly because the Indian diaspora in places like Australia and the US and Europe has become very wealthy. And so the Indian state is very, very keen to engage them in other ways. But recently, in 2016, talk of a new law has been introduced. The idea to amend the Citizenship Act of 1955. And it proposes that religious minorities from neighbouring countries could acquire citizenship within a reduced time period, reducing it down to 7 years. Now, in many ways, this sounds nice and uncontroversial, until you read the law and you realise it only applies to non-Muslim minorities. So this does not apply to Rohingya refugees, for example. It would not apply to Uyghurs coming from Xinjiang province in China. And this would be a fundamental challenge to this territorial conception of India. And it led the social activist Kavita Krishnan to say, India is not like Israel, offering the right of return to Jews anywhere in the world. Now, as with the Triple Talaq Bill, whether this is actually passed before the next elections is questionable. But not because of the BJP. It's because the BJP does not yet have a majority in the upper house, the Rajya Sabha. And that's the only reason it hasn't come to law yet, as with the Triple Talaq law. So again, I think that that's something to watch and something to worry about. In terms of policy changes, the third measure, the biggest thing I think we should focus on, although there are good and bad signs here as well, is cow protection. So cow protection was, under the Constitution, is put down to be a state subject. So states make the laws on this. There was pressure for Nehru to kind of make a law banning cow slaughter, given the fact that beef is a holy animal for Hindus. But they didn't. They put it down to the state level. And we now have a situation where 24 out of India's 29 states prohibit cow slaughter. What we then see is recently, I think last year, government actually introduced a measure banning all cattle slaughter. This is slightly problematic if you are a member of a religious minority, but also if you are a Dalit, scheduled caste person within India. And the reason for this is because it hits these groups much harder. It hits them because these communities are the people who are much more likely to be involved in the beef trade. And it also hits them because beef is a very, very cheap meat in India. It certainly isn't in the UK, although nothing is cheap in the UK after Brexit. Yeah, the prices are rising. But it certainly is in India, and banning this and the consumption of beef and the slaughter of beef is seen to be challenging to not only Muslims and Christians, but also Dalits as well. We've also seen the enforcement of this increase. So although you had this banned under Congress governments, you know, it's not just the BJP states that are banning this, Congress governments did this back in the 1950s as well. What you have seen is that enforcement of this has increased. And in 2015, there was a very prominent publicised case of Muhammad Akhlaq, who a preacher essentially stood up and was saying, this man has beef in his fridge. And a mob of 200 strong went to his house, they pulled him out, they pulled his son out, and effectively he was beaten to death over this claim, which was then showed to be not true, that he had eaten beef and was storing beef. We also see an increase in power-related hate crime in India. So this comes from the India Spend database. And you can see a massive increase from 3 cases in 2014 up to 37 in 2017. And a lot of people allege, and this is where we come back to discourse, that this has been fueled by BJP members, both at the national level and at the state level. I mean, overwhelming majority of people who have been killed in this violence are Muslims, although Dalits have also been affected as well. I should say, actually, before I go on, one final point to say is that the reason I said this is a mixed story is because when they introduced the bill on cow slaughter prohibiting this, first the Madras High Court and then the Indian Supreme Court stepped in and outlawed it, saying that this disproportionately affected certain communities. And the last I read on this, the Modi government was stepping back from this. Now, this would show that the Indian democratic institutions are acting as an effective check and balance. So it's important to recognise that it's not, something that... I think we have to be more moderate when we assess this particular policy change. We move on to my informal measures, looking at representation of groups. And as said, I'm focusing on Hindus and Muslims here. If you want to see the wider data, you'll have to come to the politics seminar that I'm giving tomorrow at 12 o'clock, because I have the wider data in that particular paper. One of the things that you see after independence was a removal of reserved seats for Muslims. And this is something that I could have put in the constitution element of this section as well. Muslims before independence had a third of the seats of India were reserved for them. They also had separate electorates. Now, separate electorates were never going to be carried forward into independent India. A third of seats were never going to be carried forward into independent India, given that Muslims were 10% of the population. But there was a very, very large debate within the Constituent Assembly arguing that Muslims needed these reserved seats to protect their interests, to protect their community. And it's important to note that scheduled tribes and the scheduled castes, the Dalits, did receive reserved seats after independence in the legislature. And this has been an important thing in terms of them being able to protect their interests. Now, obviously, having representatives there may not mean that you're actually going to have your interests protected. People may not be particularly competent, or they may just be there as tokens. It's also possible, as other people have argued, that secular political parties don't necessarily need to have religious minorities included within their ranks to protect the interests of those religious minorities. But as I show you when I come to the horizontal inequalities, the Muslim community's interests have not been well served in independent India. And I'm going to just quickly show you some data from 3 institutions. The Lok Sabina, the lower house, the Cabinet, looking at the very narrow Council of Ministers, what we would call in the UK Secretary of State, and the ministerial portfolios that Muslims have held. Now, a lot of this data comes from kind of blood and sweat of me and my PhD students. So this is new data. I'm very, very proud of it, and I'm very, very keen to engage about it. So if we look at Muslim underrepresentation in the Lok Sabina, So this shows the top line shows the election, and so you can see over time. The way that this data has been worked out refers to the proportion of the Muslims within the population. So in 1951, it's approximately 9.8% of the population. And then it takes the representation within the Lok Sabina, which in 1951 was 5%. So you take 5%, take away the proportion of their population, and you therefore end up with a score of minus, kind of 4.8%. Coming down to 2014, again, if you do the score, it's the proportion of the population has risen. It's now 14% of the population. And the representation in that Lok Sabina was 3.68%. So 3.68% of representation minus their proportion of the population, and you come up with a score 10.55%. So I think that with the exception of the spike around about the kind of Janata Dal and Indira Gandhi eras, you can see the table, there. Muslims have been underrepresented according to their population size. And that's getting worse. Importantly, this is not just a Modi phenomenon. This is true under any government, practically, although it has got worse under the Modi regime. Hindu-Muslim representation in the cabinet has been calculated according to exactly the same formula. Hindus, Muslims were generally maybe slightly overrepresented in some of the earlier cabinets. Hindus were slightly underrepresented. There was a lot more proportionality. And the scale is slightly smaller as well. So the scale on the other one I showed you went to -10. This one only goes to -6. So the difference is not as great. There is obviously some compensation at the cabinet level for the underrepresentation in the Lok Sabina. But again, we see a trend. Muslim underrepresentation is not necessarily increasing in a linear fashion, but if you look at it since independence, there's definitely underrepresentation there. And then if I look at the actual positions that Muslims have held. So Stephen Wilkinson argued in an article back in 2000 that Muslims aren't trusted with the kind of important portfolios. Bringing that up to date, because he was obviously writing up to 2000, you can see that some of what he was arguing is correct, but some of it is, I think, changes have happened. So no Muslim has ever been trusted with a finance portfolio, the Minister of Finance, and no Muslim has ever been trusted with the important defence portfolio. But you do have Muslims, 3 of them, who have been the External Affairs Minister, and you have had 1 Muslim who has held the important position of Home Ministry. But generally, if you look, where the Muslim ministers are, it tends to be in the less important portfolios, things like natural resources, energy, agriculture, rather than the 4 kind of big institutions of state. Coming to discourse. Discourse, as I said, is something that we need to focus on. And it's something I think that's changed over time in India. It's certainly changed in the UK. How people talk about Muslims in the UK frankly disgusts me now, and what's become acceptable to say. Let's look at how it's been playing out in India. So here I'm taking data from the National Elections Survey, and the original version of this, which I've adapted, was put together by Suhash Palshikar. And the question was, in a democracy, the will of the majority community should prevail. Do you agree or disagree? And you can see that in 2014, there's quite a huge spike saying the will of the majority community should prevail. So this is not just about a majority, it's about a community, which in India is understood in religious terms. If we move on to the government should make special provision to accommodate minorities, again, you can see a drop in 2014 compared to 96 and 2004. So there's a definite difference in terms of Indian population's acceptance of the rights of minorities. We can also look at the kind of things that are said and the kind of discourse that's talked about. And the big debate in India has been over this concept of love jihad. This idea that Muslim men are taking innocent Hindu girls, they're corrupting them, they're converting them to Islam, and effectively they are leading to the rise of the Muslim population of India through this. And so much so that this lady here is a Hindu from the south of India who converted to Islam. Her parents are married a Muslim. Her parents objected to this, and they took her to court and her husband to court, and she was effectively put under house arrest. And the Supreme Court ordered an investigation into whether this had been love jihad. And at this point, alarm bells were really ringing with me. Why had they taken on this concept that a lot of people accept as being used for electioneering by the BJP? But in March this year, they actually ruled that no, there was no evidence of this, which I think is a sign that Indian democracy, again, has these checks and balances. But the fact that they adopted the phrase love jihad, I think, is something that we need to watch. We also need to look at what's not said. So one of the things that's really prominent has been, after the killing of Mr. Akhlaq, the Muslim who people broke into his home, pulled him out, kicked him to death, Modi had a week-long silence on this. Now, those of you who follow Narendra Modi on Twitter, I'm not sure whether he or Donald Trump has more tweets, but I mean, they're kind of both up there. And I put a quote up here. I don't normally put long quotes up and then read from them, but this one is worth doing, I think. On the week after this, he expressed his gratitude to the American people for their hospitality, greeted a cabinet colleague and a governor on their birthdays, the people of China on National Day, and congratulated a billiards champion, all on his Twitter feed. Nothing about Mr. Akhlaq. Now, this is a prime minister of a state where someone has been, someone has been beaten to death in a brutal way. And I don't have time to go into the other tweets of his cabinet members, but this was really worrying, that someone would not speak out about that. And very, very briefly, I will talk about horizontal inequalities. Now, the Satchar Commission in 2006 pulled together an immense amount of data, and if you're interested in the question of Muslim underrepresentation and inequalities, I'd highly recommend you to read it. A lot of it wasn't necessarily new, but it really pulled it together. And they pointed out quite correctly that Muslims are lagging behind in human development indicators. So illiteracy levels of Muslims as a whole are 43%, compared to 37% of the overall population. And we know, of course, this compounds access problems to education, to government jobs. And you can see that in the All Indian Elite Civil Services, only 3.2% are Muslims, compared to 14% of the population. It's important to say their position has improved since independence, but it hasn't improved as much as the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. And the reason I mention this is because it shows that social action and government action can work to improve communities' lives. And importantly, the scheduled tribes and scheduled castes have had these reserved seats. Remember that they were taken away from Muslims. In addition, a report came out last month looking at prison within India and attitudes of different groups to the police. And it noted that the proportion of Muslims in prison was much higher than the population of any of the states that they were imprisoning. Now, we know that there may well be a socio-economic basis to this, in terms of level and crime. But the other thing it mentioned was that actually the proportion of convictions of those Muslims arrested was very low, which shows that, and other people have talked to me about this before, but it was the first time I've kind of seen this data, that actually Muslims are being picked up and pulled in, but a lot of them are being released without charge as well. When this happens in Brixton, in South London, people shout racism. And I think obviously something is happening there as well. Now, importantly, this is not, again, this is of long-standing duration. This is not just under the Modi government. This is something that has to happen all throughout India's independent history. So if we conclude by looking at, so what degrees of ethnic democracy are there in India? Constitutional, I think, is still pretty low at the moment. But I think that there are possible dangers and possible increases coming about, especially if the Uniform Civil Code directions are taken or movements are made in that direction. Citizenship, I think, is very low levels of ethnic democracy, but if that law is passed, we would expect changes to happen. Policy, we've obviously seen a lot of changes, but that's very government specific. So it's difficult to say where that's going. Representation, problems there are increasing, but again, this is of long-standing duration. Discourse is massively increasing. It's not confined to the Modi government, but you do see a spike under their government. And horizontal inequalities, I think, is probably the highest one, but that's something that's been there all throughout India's independent history. So as said, many of these problems are not recent. It's really important to make that point. But the direction of travel worries me in India. A lot of things are changing. A lot of things are being challenged, but a lot of things are changing and not for the better. But we know this is a worldwide phenomenon. This is happening in the UK, it's happening in the US. This is something we've seen the rise of populist discourse and the demonisation of the other in many, many countries. But what's interesting for me to conclude on is how the degradation of minority rights doesn't necessarily mean a country is not democratic. A country can be extremely democratic if we classify it in terms of turnout, engagement in politics. But it's not necessarily democratic if we look at the way in which certain peoples are then excluded effectively because of their minority status. So thank you very much for your attention.